Jesus Trilogy, Book 1, The Four Messiahs, Chapter 7. What are you going to say in your sermon tomorrow, honey? Elizabeth asked Zacharias, who was poring over some old scrolls that he had been trying to decipher. Not sure yet. All the people want to hear about is how and when the Messiah will come and deliver them. Old Zach, now 70, had pored through the scrolls for years looking for the answer to that very question. It was on every Hebrew mind in all of Israel, but to date no one could find the answer. There's a lot of speculation, of course. Everyone had their own theory. That guy up by Capernaum, Mathan, had quite a name for himself with his prediction that in 4 years the Messiah would come. The Messiah would recruit a large army in secret and first overwhelm Herod in the north of Israel. That would probably not be too difficult a task. Then, with momentum on his side, he would sweep down the unsuspecting Roman legion in Jerusalem. It was on all the papers. A lot of Hebrews believed it, but Herod and the Roman leaders in Jerusalem just laughed, further angering the Hebrews. Maybe I'll start giving a rousing sermon like Mathan up in Capernaum, Zacharias said. Don't you dare, he's a lunatic. You study more than any man I know, and you haven't found the answer yet. He certainly can't be right. He's just looking for a little glory, Elizabeth countered. And a little money, Zacharias sighed. You know, his church offerings have tripled in the past year. They're building a new synagogue up there to hold the crowds. I think that friend of your cousin's the carpenter. What's his name? Joseph. Yes, he's doing some of the inside work. How is your cousin? He's my second cousin, Elizabeth disgustedly corrected her aging husband. Whatever. I haven't seen Mary in 2 years. One of these days I'll call on her. It's such a long trip down there, and my bones don't take travel like they used to. Your bones never did take travel. What do you say? Nothing. Why don't you ask her to come here for a visit, Zacharias said. I'll send her a letter and see what she's up to, Elizabeth said, thinking it would be good to see Mary again. But you never did answer me, Zach. What? What are you going to preach about tomorrow? Nothing much. The aged couple had a quiet supper, and each read for a while. Zacharias' eyes finally became heavy, and they both went off to bed. Between Zacharias snoring and his having to get up 2 or 3 times a night to urinate, Elizabeth got little sleep. So a few years back, they began to sleep in separate beds. Tonight, as they did each night, they knelt to pray. Zacharias' prayers were always lengthy. He was extremely conscientious and would pray for as many of his parishioners as he could remember. Elizabeth's prayers were a short variety, but this night she took a little more time, and the mention of Mary set her to thinking, and the more Elizabeth thought about her, the more troubled she became. Dear God, please be with my dear cousin Mary. Amen. She finished and went to the bathroom. When she came out, she noticed that Zach had gotten into bed and was already waxing musical with his infernal snoring. Sometimes he would stop breathing even for as long as a minute, but he would always start up again. It would serve him right if he would quit altogether, all the sleepless nights he'd caused her. She silently apologized for the thought, but she knew she half meant it. And you better go to the bathroom before you fall asleep, Elizabeth said. I'll just be up in a couple hours anyway. Don't you dare wet that bed again. Elizabeth's urges had not decreased much. She was 60. It had been 15 years since her last period, but she still enjoyed sex and thought of it often. Since Zacharias' prostate started acting up about 5 years ago, nights of love had been few and far between. Sometimes Zach could get an erection and even had an occasional orgasm, usually on special occasions. But they had to work very hard for that to happen. One time she feared his heart might give out, but he recovered. She sometimes wished her urges would go away. They'd had a wonderful love life. Why did God take that away from people who were in love? She slipped out of the bed and crawled in bed with her husband. Surprisingly, he wasn't asleep. He couldn't get the scrolls out of his head. When was this Messiah coming? Elizabeth began fondling him. He turned toward her and returned the favor, knowing full well that he would not be able to satisfy her this night. His mind was too full of Messiah. Elizabeth stopped caressing and kissing. They just lay there in each other's arms. I love you, she said. I love you too, he answered. She slipped back into her own bed, turned toward the wall, and began to cry. Sabbath morning was a beautiful day in the little Judean city. It lay up in the hills, and one could see for miles from the top of the city wall. The sun shone brightly. The old temple was not in the best condition, but on this day even it seemed to have a special radiance. Good morning, Jabeth. Good morning, Ammon. Good morning, Ammon. And how is the little woman today? Zach liked to be early to church so he could greet everyone as they came in. How are you, Miriam, and how are the twins today? Miriam's twins were 2 years old and a handful, but they were so precious. Elizabeth so loved the children, but it never could have any of her own. She and Zacharias had undergone all kinds of tests, but though the doctors acknowledged that they were both perfectly healthy, all they could do was keep trying. And they tried, and they tried. They'd probably made love more than any other couple in all Judea, but it was to no avail. They tried so much they even got sick of it. No, not really, but the frustration was there. Elizabeth and Zachariah finally talked it out and went back to the normal 3 times a week. But that emptiness remained for both of them. Adoption was discussed, but it was just too expensive. She could take a job and did, but it still wouldn't be enough. She prayed about it, but finally gave up praying too. She quit her job, began to babysit some. That was actually pleasure, not work. Where's that man? Elizabeth called to the deaconess Anne. What's the matter with him? We've studied our Bible lessons and we sang songs, and the children are getting restless. That little Jonathan's been crying for 10 minutes. There you are. What's the matter with you? Get in there and preach. Elizabeth gave him a nudge, and Zach walked toward the door of the sanctuary. He climbed the stairs to the pulpit and opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He tried again, but again nothing came out. The congregation began to murmur. Elder Horeb came up and said, "Are you okay, Zacharias?" Zacharias nodded yes, but again when he opened his mouth no sound came out. The crowd was making more noise now. Is there a doctor in the house? Dr. Luke strode to the podium and began to examine the old priest right on the stage. His pulse was strong and there was no apparent respiratory distress, no weakness of the extremities. He motioned for a candle and peered down Zach's throat. All appeared normal. Were you ill recently? Luke asked. No, he's been fine, Elizabeth answered for Zacharias, her disgust turning to worry. What's wrong with him, Doc? Appears he has some type of stroke. Can't be sure. We'll have to watch him overnight in the hospital. Zacharias shook his head no, but Elizabeth said emphatically, You're going to the hospital right now. Can he walk, or do we have to carry him? Zacharias waved his hand and began to walk. Okay, walk, but we are going to the hospital to have you checked out. Due to this unexpected occurrence, services will be canceled for today. Have a good Sabbath day and remember our priest Zacharias in your prayers, Elder Horeb said, concluding the service. Zacharias spent 3 days in Good Samaritan Hospital but never regained his voice. Special herbal medicines and treatments consisting of heat and neck massage did nothing. As it appeared that no further complications would set in, Zacharias was sent home Tuesday. Dr. Luke told Elizabeth he still didn't know the cause of the stroke, but suspected some type of infection. If indeed this was the case, he expected it would eventually clear and the voice would return. If it was due to some other unknown cause, it might be a permanent problem. Time alone would tell. Time, she thought. You never can get a straight answer from these doctors. With all their training, you'd think they would have better answers than time. She remembered similar answers to the questions she and Zacharias had posed to Luke's father, also a doctor, when she was trying to get pregnant. Time didn't help then, and it probably wouldn't now. Can I fix you something to eat? You're probably starved. Hospital food is pretty bad. Zacharias shook his head in the negative and sat down in the chair. Mako came up and licked his face. Mako was a big sheepdog who was like their child. I'm sure glad it was you who lost his voice and not me. I'd go crazy if I couldn't talk. She regretted the cruel statement as soon as it left her lips. I'm sorry, you know what I mean. I'm sure it will come back soon. She was digging a deeper hole, so she shut up. After supper, in its one-sided conversation, she got Zacharias a tablet and asked him to write something. Anything. She was going crazy with only Mako to talk to. He wrote, "The day has been long and I'm weary. I think I'll turn in. I'll have to write to the high priest down in Nazareth about getting my pension started." "Dr. Luke said your voice should come back," Elizabeth said, alarm in her voice. "I'm 70. I should let someone younger take over anyway. Young Eliakim will graduate soon and has expressed interest in moving back home," he wrote. "But he's just a kid," Elizabeth argued. "You'll learn," he wrote. "On the job? Great. We must be willing to let God take care of it." He put the pen down. He got up to go to the bathroom, then went off to bed. Elizabeth crawled into bed an hour later. She was vaguely surprised not to hear the usual snoring. Maybe this stroke or whatever it was had cured that problem, but she was so used to the noise she lay awake for a while thinking. Just as she was about to doze off, she felt Zacharias next to her. He was firm against her, something rare these days. She turned toward him, and he put his arm around her and began making sweet love to her. They had been great lovers once, and for some strange reason it seemed like old times. Memory after memory raced through her mind of all the wonderful times they had shared. She didn't want this night to end. By morning, when Elizabeth woke, Zacharias was already up, kneeling in prayer out in the yard. The sun was just peeking over the east hills. "Oh, great, wonderful God, forgive my unforgivable weak faith." Elizabeth walked toward the door, but stopped short. She saw his writing tablet on the table. She picked it up and read, "I know you cannot forgive my sin and weakness, but if it be your will, allow it to happen as you have said." Elizabeth turned and began to cook his favorite breakfast. Payment for the most wonderful night in years, she thought aloud. "Good morning, love." He wandered into the kitchen and she kissed him. "And how is my man this morning?" she asked. He looked a little worse for wear. "You were wonderful last night. It was like 30 years ago on the boat to Cyprus, remember?" He shook his head, disrupting her euphoria. "Zacharias," Elizabeth raised her voice. "What were you asking the Lord to forgive you for?" she quizzed. He gave her a long look, walked over and sighed, put his arm around her shoulder. He was a foot taller than her petite 5'2" frame. Her hair was nearly all gray now, but she looked as good as any 60-year-old and better than most 50-year-olds. He appreciated that she took good care of herself. She motioned for him to come over. "Eat," she said. "You'll need your strength for tonight, my dear." He ate slowly, and when he finished, he motioned for her to bring him the tablet. "God took away my voice," he wrote. She grinned. "No, he wouldn't do that. It's some infection or stroke or something." He wrote on. "He took away my voice last Sabbath. I went into the holy place before church. An angel was there." She began to laugh. "You crack, dear. It must have been a stroke after all." He persisted. "He said we would have a son." She was really serious, and her tone changed. "You can't be serious, are you?" She sat. "What else?" she queried. "He is to proclaim the Messiah," he wrote. Her mouth dropped wide open. "Impossible. I'm 60. This is some sort of joke. You've not only had a stroke, you've lost your mind." "No joke," he wrote. "God's truth." It hit her like a ton of bricks. His lost voice, last night, so strange, yet so real. "Oh, no," she cried, "it can't be." He nodded in the affirmative. She put her hands on her forehead and began to cry loudly. He reached over and put his hand on her shoulder. "I can't do this. What will people think? I'm too old." But as she uttered the words, she knew it was true, as the sun was coming up every morning. "Oh, Zacharias, how could you? I mean, it was wonderful, but I don't know what I mean," she said, and commenced crying louder. He knew when to leave her alone. He went out on the porch, sat down, and returned to praying. That night, as they lay in their separate beds, they made a pact. Neither would tell anyone else until the baby was born.